Rick Sanchez can step into any reality that has ever existed. He can break the laws of physics on a Tuesday. He has humiliated gods, toppled governments, buried his own dead body, turned himself into a pickle, and built a machine designed to end his own life. And by every measure that counts, he is one of the loneliest beings ever put on television. That contradiction is what this video is about. Rick and Morty has been on the air for over 10 years, and most of the writing about it circles the same few topics: the nihilism, the science fiction, the jokes. What almost nobody discusses is the breakdown the show has been documenting underneath all of it. A quiet record of every time the smartest man alive fell apart. Rick insists that nothing matters, and everything he does proves he cannot believe it. Tonight, we walk through every single piece of it. Welcome to Ricktopus. Subscribing is free, and it genuinely helps. Let us get into it. The catchphrase that was always a cry for help. Late in 2013, on a channel that mostly showed cartoons for adults who could not sleep, a new show appeared without much warning. It aired after midnight on Adult Swim, in those strange, small hours when the television feels like it is speaking only to the people still awake. Most of the viewers who stumbled onto it that first night were not expecting anything special. The animation looked loose and a little ugly, almost as if it had been drawn that way on purpose. The two main characters were a nervous teenage boy and his grandfather, and the grandfather spent most of the opening episode drunk, drooling, and dragging the boy across the galaxy on a mission the boy did not understand and had not agreed to. It looked, at a glance, like a simple comedy about a terrible grandpa and the scared kid stuck following him around. For a very long time, that is exactly how people described it. The grandfather had a name that would soon become famous all over the world: Rick Sanchez. From his very first scene, the show gave him a clear and simple design: wild gray hair that stuck straight up as if he had been struck by lightning, with a faint blue tint to it, a thin line of drool that lived at the corner of his mouth and never quite went away, a metal flask that seemed welded to his hand. When he talked, he burped in the middle of his own sentences, and the words tumbled out fast and slurred, like a man who could not be bothered to slow down for anyone in the room. He was loud and he was rude. He treated his daughter's home like a hotel, and his grandson like a spare part he could use and throw away. On the surface, he was built to make people laugh, and he did. The cruelty was the joke, and at first, the joke was all anyone saw. Somewhere in those early episodes, Rick began saying something odd. In the 5th episode of the first season, an episode named Me Seeks and Destroy, he threw out a string of happy-sounding nonsense at full volume. Wubba lubba dub dub. He shouted it like a man at a party trying to pull the attention back to himself. The phrase carried no obvious meaning. It sounded like baby talk, or like the noise a cartoon character might make when bouncing off the walls with too much energy. The show offered no explanation. Rick simply said it, grinned, and barreled on to the next thing. Away from the screen, those sounds had come straight from the voice actor, Justin Roiland, who made them up on the spot inside the recording booth. He shaped them loosely around the whooping noise that studio audiences used to make on an old late-night program called The Arsenio Hall Show. The whole thing was meant to be foolish. It was meant, in that first moment, to mean absolutely nothing at all. Across the rest of the season, the phrase kept coming back. Rick said it when he felt good. He said it when he landed a joke. He said it to fill an awkward silence with noise so that nobody could fill it with a real question. By the time the season was ending, the words had become his signature, the line fans repeated to one another, a little flag of pure goofiness planted on top of a goofy old man. And then, in the final episode of that first season, the show did something that quietly rewired the meaning of every laugh that had come before. The episode was called Ricksy Business. In it, Rick throws an enormous party while the rest of the family is away on a trip. Among the strange guests is one of Rick's oldest and closest friends, a calm and serious figure called Bird Person, who is part man and part bird and speaks slowly, with the heavy patience of someone who has lived through too much. At one point in the chaos, Bird Person pulls Morty aside and asks him a plain question. Does Morty actually know what wubba lubba dub dub means? Morty waves it off without much thought. To him, the phrase is nothing more than his grandfather's stupid catchphrase, a meaningless sound. Bird Person tells him the real translation. In his own people's language, those bright and bouncy words mean that the speaker is in great pain, and that he is asking someone, anyone, to help him. Nothing in the room stops. The music keeps thumping, and the party rolls on toward its messy ending. Morty barely even reacts, brushing the whole idea aside and insisting his grandfather only says it as a joke. The exchange lasts a handful of seconds and is gone, yet the information settles in and refuses to leave. Every single time Rick had screamed that phrase across the season, while he drank and laughed and tossed the words around like confetti, he had been saying the same hidden thing. He was hurting. He was asking for help. And he had built that request best out of sounds so ridiculous that not one person around him would ever stop to take it seriously. He could stand in the middle of a crowded room, cry out at the top of his voice, and remain completely invisible. That is the first and softest version of a pattern this story will trace for the next 2 hours. Rick tells the truth about himself almost constantly. He simply wraps that truth in something silly enough that no one is forced to hear it. The drinking lives in the very same place. Rick is almost never shown sober for more than a moment. The flask turns up in nearly every scene, and early on, the show treats it as part of the comedy, the brilliant scientist who also happens to be a falling down mess. Beneath those jokes, though, the alcohol is doing the exact same work as the catchphrase. It holds the feelings at arm's length. It smudges the edges of a mind the show insists is the sharpest in all of existence. A man who can build a working spaceship out of a pile of garbage in a single afternoon cannot seem to make it through one ordinary day without numbing himself first. Season 1 never stops to lecture about any of this. It just shows the flask again and again until it blends into the background and the audience quietly stops noticing that the cleverest being alive is also the one trying hardest never to feel a single thing. The clearest early proof of how far Rick will go to escape a problem arrives in the 6th episode of the season, an episode titled Rick Potion Number 9. The setup is small, almost childish. Morty has a crush on a girl at his school and begs his grandfather for help winning her over. Rick, irritated and only half listening, mixes a quick love serum and hands it over with barely a warning. The serum works far too well. It spreads through the air and into the flue going around the school, and within hours, the entire human population of Earth has fallen into a mindless obsession with Morty, chasing him through the streets in a desperate mob. Rick tries to undo it. His first correction goes wrong, and the next one goes wrong in a worse way, and each failed attempt twists the people of the planet a little further from human. By the end, nearly everyone on Earth has been warped into a deformed, lumbering monster. The show names these creatures Cronenbergs, a quiet wink toward a film director famous for stomach-turning body horror. The world is finished. There is no clean path back to the way things were. And right here, the episode makes the move that defines Rick far more sharply than any genius invention ever could. He does not keep struggling to save this ruined Earth. Instead, he tears open a portal, searches through the endless other versions of the planet, and finds one almost identical to his own. A world where a different Rick and a different Morty have just died in an accident out in the garage. He takes his Morty by the arm and walks him calmly into that other place. What comes next is one of the bleakest things the show has ever asked a child character to do. Rick and Morty quietly bury the bodies of the dead Rick and Morty in the backyard, the lifeless versions of themselves, so that they can slip into the empty spaces those two left behind. Morty stands over the shallow grave and stares down at his own dead face in the dirt. A soft and aching song drifts over the moment, a track by the band Mazzy Star named Look On Down from the Bridge. No jokes arrive to break the tension. The episode simply rests inside the horror of what has just happened. A boy has watched an entire world die because of one small favor, and now he must pretend that everything is fine, inside a house that is not his, surrounded by a family that has no idea he is a stranger wearing their son's face. Rick, for his part, treats the whole thing as a tidy fix. A world broke, so he found a fresh one. That same mournful song will return many years later, deep into the 7th season, playing over a completely different scene, on the day Rick finally claims the revenge he has chased across his entire life and discovers it leaves him hollow. The seed is planted here, in the 1st season, and the show waters it patiently for a decade. Rick Potion Number 9 reveals something essential about the way this man handles catastrophe. He does not sit inside his losses. He does not grieve where anyone can witness it. When a problem grows too large and too painful to repair, he swaps out the broken thing for a working copy and walks away, carrying the damage off to somewhere no one will ever see it. A planet full of dead people becomes nothing more heavy than a backyard chore. The genius who can step between universes uses that very power, at least in part, to keep outrunning the wreckage piling up behind him. The choice is reckless, and it is cold. By the time the episode fades out, it is also clear that the recklessness and the coldness are not separate from his pain. They are the method he has built to survive it. Later in the same season, in an episode called Close Rick Encounter of the Rick Kind, the show pulls the camera back in a way that makes Rick's loneliness almost difficult to sit with. Morty discovers that there are countless versions of Rick scattered across countless universes, so many of them that they have organized into their own government, a body known as the Council of Ricks. These Ricks have raised a vast home base called the Citadel, where thousands of versions of the same man crowd together and try to run their own affairs. And almost none of them can stand the particular Rick at the heart of this show. They brand him a renegade. They treat him as a threat. A number of them would happily see him dead. Here sits a man surrounded by an endless supply of himself, and even his own reflections cannot bear to be in the same room. The one person in all of creation who should understand Rick completely is Rick, copied out to infinity, and the result of that math is not comfort or company. It is a manhunt with his own face on every wanted poster. The season folds the same theme of pain into a smaller and stranger shape through one of its most beloved inventions. Back in Meeseeks and Destroy, the very episode where the catchphrase is born, Rick hands the family a simple box. Press the button on top, and a friendly blue creature called a Mr. Meeseeks pops into being to help with one single task, then politely vanishes the instant that task is done. The hidden cruelty is that merely existing causes a Meeseeks pain. They are not meant to linger. The longer one is trapped in the world without finishing its goal, the more it suffers and the more frantic and unhinged it becomes, until it is willing to do almost anything to be released from being alive. A creature that pleads for the chance to stop existing, that treats its own short life as a weight it cannot wait to set down, hums away in the background of an episode dressed up as a goofy adventure about a magic box. The show keeps tucking these ideas into the corners of its comedy. Life as a thing to be endured rather than enjoyed. Existence as a low and constant ache, the same ache in the end that lives inside the man with the flask and the foolish phrase. For all of this weight, the first season was rarely received as anything heavy at the time. Reviews and fans mostly talked about how clever the science fiction was, how fast the jokes came, how strange and rude and inventive the whole thing felt compared to other cartoons. The sadness was there in plain view, but it was moving too quickly, buried under too many laughs for most people to name it on a first watch. Only later, once the show had earned years of trust and the pieces could be slowed down and set side by side, did the early episodes start to read as something closer to a portrait of a man quietly coming undone. By the time that first season reached its end, the show had pulled off something most of its early audience never noticed while they were busy laughing. It had drawn a careful and patient picture of a man falling apart in slow motion, and it had hidden every brushstroke of that picture inside a joke. The catchphrase was a confession. The flask was a shield. The world-ending adventure closed with a child lowering himself into the soil. The infinite family of Ricks turned out to be a crowd of strangers who wanted him gone. None of this was framed as tragedy back then. All of it was framed as comedy, fast and bright and bizarre, and the grief only surfaced once the laughter stopped and the fragments were finally lined up next to each other. That is where this whole story truly begins. Not with a collapse that everyone can see and point at, but with a man who taught himself to break quietly, right out in the open, in a voice loud enough to be heard by anyone and silly enough to be ignored by everyone. Everything in the first season is the fine print at the bottom of the page. The pain is genuine, but it stays mostly under the surface, dressed up in bright colors and waved cheerfully away. In the season that follows, the show stops letting Rick hide behind the noise. It places him alone in his garage on the worst night of his life, beside a machine he has built for one terrible purpose, and it asks the audience to watch closely as the jokes finally, completely run out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first season buried Rick's pain inside a cheerful catchphrase, a flask that never left his hand, and a boy digging his own grave in the yard. Underneath all that comedy sat a man already breaking, just quietly enough that no one looked too hard. In the next section, the hiding finally ends, and Rick faces the one night the show refuses to play for a single laugh. Section 2, the night Rick tried to end it. Season 2 of the show began the slow work of pulling back the curtain. The first season had buried Rick's sadness under speed and jokes, letting it flicker at the edges of the frame and then vanish before anyone could name it. By the second season, the writers seemed more willing to slow down, to let a scene sit in its discomfort, to point the camera straight at the wound instead of cutting away. The third episode of that season is where this new willingness reached its lowest and most honest point. It is the episode where the comedy stops cold, and the show forces its audience to watch a man try to die. The episode carries a crude and silly title, the kind the show is fond of, called Autoerotic Assimilation. It first aired in August of 2015, written by Ryan Ridley and directed by Brian Newton. The premise sounds like another wild adventure. Rick, Morty, and Summer are flying through space when they pick up a distress signal from a damaged alien ship. Rick assumes everyone aboard is already dead and decides to go looting, treating the signal as an invitation to steal from corpses. Instead, the trio finds the surviving crew still alive, and within moments, a hive mind sweeps through the ship and takes the remaining crew members into itself, turning separate people into parts of a single shared third being. To Rick's surprise, the hive mind knows him. Its name is Unity, voiced for most of the episode by Christina Hendricks, and Rick admits, awkwardly, that the two of them used to date. Unity is unlike any partner a person could imagine. It is not one body, but thousands, an entire planet's worth of people whose minds it controls and speaks through at once. When Rick reunites with Unity, he is not meeting a single old flame. He is walking back into a relationship with a being large enough to give him anything he wants, a partner that can become a crowd, a city, a whole world arranged entirely around his desires. What follows is a bender unlike anything the show had attempted before. Rick throws himself into Unity completely. The two of them spiral into days of partying, of drugs, of strange and excessive pleasures, with Unity bending its assimilated population to satisfy whatever Rick asks for next. He requests a stadium full of redheads. He asks Unity to take over a giraffe so it can join in. The episode plays much of this for dark laughs, but underneath the jokes, a clear picture forms. Rick is not happy in any steady way. He is drowning. Given a partner with unlimited capacity to please him, he uses it to escape himself as hard and as fast as he possibly can. The same way he uses the flask, only larger. While Rick loses himself, Morty and Summer wander the planet on their own, and the show runs a second story alongside the first. Summer is horrified that Unity controls every mind on the planet, stripping away each person's individual will, and she pushes the freed inhabitants to fight for their independence. The moment they regain their separate minds, though, the population does not blossom into a peaceful, free society. It splits instantly along old hatreds and tumbles into a violent race war. Morty, already worn down by a life of Rick's adventures, simply shrugs at the chaos, treating it as one more grim fact of the universe. The point lands quietly beneath the comedy. Control is ugly, and so is freedom, and there are no clean answers about how anyone should live. Far from the partying, back on Earth, Beth and Jerry find their own small disaster. They discover a hatch hidden in the floor of Rick's garage and a secret room beneath it. And inside that room sits a deformed, suffering alien creature that Rick has locked away. Standing over this evidence of Rick's secrets, Beth and Jerry begin to argue. And the argument is not really about the creature at all. It is about their marriage, about Beth's fear of being abandoned, about Jerry's resentment, about all the rot they carry around in their relationship and project onto each other. The captured alien grows so disgusted by listening to them that it tears itself free, declaring them both the worst before leaving them with the wreckage of their own self-loathing. The show keeps stacking these portraits of broken people, family by family, planet by planet, until the loneliness at the center of the episode feels almost total. Eventually, the relationship between Rick and Unity reaches the same end that every relationship in Rick's life seems to reach. Unity comes to understand something painful about the two of them together. They are too alike. Both of them turn the people around them into copies of themselves. Unity through its assimilation, and Rick through the sheer force of his influence, the way everyone near him slowly bends to orbit his moods and his choices. Unity realizes that when it is with Rick, it loses itself, that he brings out the worst version of who it is, and that he is, in some strange way, better at erasing other people than Unity is, even though he never tries. So Unity does the only thing it feels strong enough to do. It leaves. Across the entire planet, it writes out farewell notes for Rick to find, each one in a slightly different voice, explaining that it cannot be with him because he will never change, and that staying with him means losing itself entirely. Then the whole population is simply gone, and Rick is alone in an empty world, holding a goodbye written 1,000 times over. Alone, Rick takes Morty and goes home. The partying is over. The distraction has packed itself up and flown away, and there is nothing left between him and the feelings he has spent the whole episode running from. He walks into his garage, the one place that is entirely his, and what he does there is the darkest sequence the show had produced up to that point. Inside the garage, Rick begins to build. He assembles a death ray, a machine designed to do one thing. Before he turns it on himself, though, he does something that gives the whole scene its terrible weight. He unfreezes one of the deformed, suffering creatures he keeps stored away, a twisted thing in constant pain, and rather than treating it with the cruelty he shows almost everyone, he comforts it. On the verge of tears, he holds the screaming, miserable creature gently, soothing it, before vaporizing it with the ray and ending its suffering for good. It is a mercy killing, performed with a tenderness Rick almost never allows himself to show another living thing. And the moment he finishes granting that mercy to the creature, he turns the same machine toward himself. Rick lowers his head into position in front of the death ray and sets it to fire. There is no speech. There are no jokes. He does not explain himself to anyone because there is no one there to hear it. The machine begins its slow charge toward firing, and Rick waits, drunk and hollowed out, for it to finish. vanish. What saves him is not a change of heart and not a rescue. He simply passes out, slumping unconscious before the ray can fully power up and the weapon never fires. He survives his own attempt by pure accident, by the same alcohol that has been numbing him the entire series, finally numbing him past the point of staying awake to die. A song carries the whole sequence, a quiet track by the band Chaos Chaos called Do You Feel It? The music does the work that dialogue usually does on the show, swelling with a sad sincerity while the images stay almost wordless. Everything about the construction of the scene is built to strip the comedy away. The camera moves slowly, the lighting is low and gentle. The silence between the musical beats is allowed to stretch. A series that fires jokes at the audience several times a minute deliberately empties the room of them, so that the only thing left is a lonely old man and a machine he built to stop being lonely in the most permanent way there is. The next morning arrives with a cruel and ordinary calm. The episode zooms out to show Rick still passed out at his workstation, having lain there through the entire night and into the following day, while outside in the driveway, Jerry cheerfully whacks the overgrown weeds, completely unaware that the smartest being in the universe nearly ended his life a few feet away. Life simply continues. The grass still needs cutting. No one knows what happened in the garage, and no one ever will, because Rick will never tell them. After the credits, the episode adds one final, quietly devastating beat. Rick travels to the ship of Beta 7, another hive mind that had been hovering nearby, hoping to grow closer to Unity, and Rick demands to be allowed to see Unity again. Beta 7 refuses him, informing Rick that Unity now considers him a hostile presence and will not see him, and threatening to attack if Rick does not leave. Rick, who moments earlier had tried to kill himself over this loss, lingers anyway, unwilling to walk away, until Morty gently reminds him that the two of them are supposed to be going to see a movie. Only then does Rick let it go and leave. The man who can conquer governments and outsmart his own infinite reflections cannot make a single relationship stay, and cannot stop himself from standing at the door of one that has already ended, asking to be let back in. Autoerotic assimilation answers a question the first season only hinted at. The catchphrase, the one that secretly means he is in great pain and asking for help, was not an exaggeration or a clever bit of writing for its own sake. The pain is real, and it runs deep enough to nearly end him. Rick needs other people to feel anything close to whole, and he cannot admit that need, and he cannot hold on to the people who might fill it, because the same qualities that make him brilliant make him unbearable to live beside. When the people leave, as they always do, he is left alone with a mind sharp enough to build any machine he can imagine, including one whose only purpose is to make him stop existing. The mercy he showed the suffering creature in the garage is the mercy he was trying to grant himself. The season did not end there, and it ended on a second act of self-destruction, quieter and dressed in nobler clothes. The 10th and final episode of the season, called The Wedding Squanchers, brought the family to the wedding of Bird Person, the same friend who had once translated Rick's catchphrase. The episode first aired in October of 2015. Rick had no interest in attending, joking grimly that weddings are like funerals with cake, a line that would turn out to be far more accurate than he meant it. After drinking enough to soften the edges, and after Morty encouraged him to open up and be present, Rick gave a heartfelt toast to his oldest friend, allowing himself a rare moment of genuine warmth and connection in front of the people who mattered to him. The warmth lasted only minutes. Bird Person's bride, Tammy, who had seemed like an ordinary young woman from Summer's school, revealed herself to be a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation, an operation that had been built specifically to trap Rick and the other old rebels he ran with. The reception erupted into a shootout. Tammy gunned down Bird Person without hesitation, killing Rick's closest friend in front of him, and Federation agents surrounded the building. Rick managed to get his family out and away, but the cost was high and the consequences were permanent. The family could no longer safely return to Earth because the Federation would be searching for them there. What came next was a slow, sad sequence of the family searching for a new home. They visited a planet orbiting an endlessly screaming sun, and a planet where everything existed only as corn on the cob, before finally hiding out on a tiny world far from the reach of the Federation. The mood was not adventurous. It was tired and frightened. A family with nowhere to belong, crammed onto a rock at the edge of everything because of the life Rick had dragged them into. And it was here, on this small planet, that Rick made his second self-destructive choice of the season. While Rick was off exploring, Jerry quietly suggested to the rest of the family that they should return to Earth and turn Rick into the Federation, arguing that Rick's selfishness had ruined their lives, and that he would never sacrifice anything for them in return. The rest of the family refused. Beth, Summer, and Morty stood up for Rick, saying they wanted to stay with him no matter the cost, out of simple, unconditional love for him them his family. What none of them realized was that Rick was hiding beneath the floor of the house, listening to every word. He heard his family defend him. He heard them choose him over their own safety and comfort. And so Rick did the thing that, on the surface, looked like the most selfless act of his life. He decided to turn himself in. He contacted the Federation, claiming to be Jerry while doing it, and arranged his own surrender so that his family could be sent safely back to Earth and live ordinary lives without him. Morty confronted him, telling Rick that he would never forgive him for leaving again. Rick turned himself in anyway. The season closed with Rick imprisoned by the Galactic Federation, Earth absorbed into Federation territory, and the family back home without him. Read alongside The Garage, the surrender reveals itself as another form of the same impulse. In autoerotic assimilation, Rick tried to remove himself from the world with a death ray. In The Wedding Squanchers, he removed himself from his family by walking into a prison, framing it as a gift while choosing, once again, to take himself out of the picture. Both endings are about a man who, when the pain becomes too great or the love becomes too real, decides that the cleanest solution is to make himself disappear. One disappearance was pointed inward and bloody. The other was disguised as sacrifice. The instinct underneath them was exactly the same. The surrender did not bring Rick peace, and it did not last. It dropped him into a cell deep inside the Galactic Federation, locked away from everyone he had tried to protect by leaving. What he would do to claw his way out of that cell in the opening minutes of the next season would not look anything like a quiet man accepting his fate. It would be the loudest, bloodiest, most furious crash of his entire life, and it would begin with a story about a dead wife that Rick swore was a lie. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 2 stopped hiding the wound, showing Rick build a death ray in his own garage and then trade himself to a prison the moment his family proved they loved him. Both endings were the same choice wearing different masks. A man deciding the kindest thing he can do is vanish. In the next section, Rick wakes up in that Federation cell, and the way he escapes turns his sorrow into a massacre. Section 3, the fabricated origin and the massacre that followed. After the second season ended with Rick locked inside a Galactic Federation cell, the show went quiet for a long time. More than a year and a half passed in the real world before the next chapter arrived, and when it did, it arrived without warning, dumped onto the Adult Swim website on the first day of April in 2017 as a kind of joke on the audience. The episode was written by Mike McMahon and directed by Juan Mesa Leon. Its title was The Rick Shank Rickdemption, and it picked up exactly where the surrender had left off, with Rick imprisoned, the family back on a conquered Earth, and a man who had chosen to disappear now sitting in a box, waiting to find out what the Federation would do with him. The episode opens in a calm and ordinary place. Rick is sitting in a cozy diner with his family, eating breakfast, talking about how he escaped from space prison. Everything looks warm and normal. Then Rick notices that something is wrong. He turns to Jerry and orders him to fold himself in half 12 times in a row. Jerry strains and manages only 6 folds before he cannot continue, and that failure tells Rick everything. No real person could do what Rick asked, and no real Jerry would even try without complaint, which means none of this is real. The diner is a simulation, a fake world built inside Rick's own mind. A Galactic Federation agent named Cornelius Daniel, voiced by Nathan Fillion, has linked himself into Rick's brain and constructed this comfortable scene in order to trick Rick into relaxing his guard and revealing the one secret the Federation wants above all else, the formula for traveling between dimensions. Rick, knowing he is being watched from inside his own head, decides to give the agent a story. He offers up an origin, a sad and human explanation for how the smartest man in the universe came to be. In this memory, a younger Rick lives quietly with his wife, named Diane, and their small daughter, named Beth. One day, another version of Rick from a different dimension appears in his garage and offers him the secret of interdimensional travel, inviting him into a larger life across the multiverse. The younger Rick turns the offer down, saying that kind of endless travel sounds lonely. In response, the visiting Rick drops a bomb that kills Diane and the young Beth where they stand. The grieving Rick, left with nothing, then unlocks the science of portal travel on his own and sets out into the infinite. The agent watches this unfold and is moved by it, slowly eating a packet of dipping sauce while a man relives the worst day of his life. The show frames the entire memory as a fabrication, a tale Rick made up to manipulate his captor. It would become important later, in ways the episode does not yet admit, but in this moment it is presented as a lie. Once the agent is distracted and satisfied, Rick springs the real trap. He has been using the brain link not to be read, but to read back, and he hijacks the connection to leap out of his own mind and into the body of the agent. From there, Rick begins to move through the prison prison like a ghost wearing borrowed skin. He transfers his consciousness from one body to the next, slipping from guard to guard, walking through locked doors as whoever he needs to be, leaving confused and dying bodies behind him. The cleverness that the show usually plays for laughs is here turned into something cold and efficient and deadly. Each body he abandons is a person who, a moment later, is shot or blown up or left to take the blame. The escape does not stop at the prison walls. Rick makes his way to the Citadel of Ricks, the home base where thousands of versions of himself live and govern, and there he plays his largest card. He had earlier sabotaged the systems that control the Federation's money, and now the trap closes. With a single change, the value of the Galactic Federation's currency drops to nothing. An entire empire, one that spanned countless worlds and had swallowed Earth whole, collapses in minutes because its money has become worthless overnight. Soldiers abandon their posts. The occupation of Earth ends, not through a war, but through bankruptcy, a government dissolving into panic and ruin. Along the way, the Citadel itself is thrown into chaos and violence, with Rick's and Morty's dying in the disorder Rick leaves in his wake. One man, clawing his way out of a single cell, topples a galactic government and guts the leadership of his own kind in the span of one episode. The construction of all this is worth sitting with. The show could have written a simple, triumphant jailbreak, the hero punching his way to freedom while the audience cheers. Instead, it built something that feels closer to a horror movie about competence. Rick does not fight his way out so much as disassemble everyone in his path with the same flat efficiency he brings to building a machine. There is a grim irony threaded through it too. Only one episode earlier, Rick had handed himself over to this same government out of what looked like love, choosing to vanish so his family could be safe and free. Now he is butchering his way back to them, undoing his own sacrifice in a tide of bodies. The act of love and the act of slaughter are two ends of the same restless, self-destroying energy. He could not sit in the cell any more than he could sit with his grief. When Rick, Morty, and Summer finally return home, the Federation is gone and the occupation is over, but the house they come back to is quietly falling apart. Jerry is unemployed once again. Worn down and threatened by Rick's return and the way his own family looks at the old man like a hero, Jerry forces the issue. He demands that Beth choose between her husband and her father. Beth, relieved simply to have her family home and safe, chooses in a way that ends her marriage. Jerry and Beth decide to divorce. A galaxy was overturned in space, and at the same time, in a small suburban house, a family was quietly broken in half. The episode saves its darkest moment for the very end, and it is not an explosion. It is a conversation in the garage. With Beth and Summer gone from the room and Morty lying on the floor, Rick explains what all of it was really for. He tells Morty that this will be the darkest year of their adventures. He reveals that he had himself captured on purpose, that the whole plan was to make both the Galactic Federation and Jerry go away, because Jerry had threatened to turn him in. He admits that he has now replaced both of them as the head of the family and the dominant figure in Morty's life. He confesses that the only reason he bothered to rescue Summer and Morty at all was that Beth would never have taken him back without her children returned safely, which means the rescue was a calculation, not an act of love. And then he tells Morty the cruelest part. If Morty repeats any of this, Rick will simply deny it, and the family will believe Rick, because to them, he is the hero who saved them. Morty is now trapped, bound to do whatever Rick says, with no way to prove what kind of man his grandfather really is. Then the rant takes its strangest turn. Rick pivots, almost wildly, to the subject of a fast food condiment. He declares that what truly drives him, his real mission, the goal that will carry the whole story all the way to its end, is finding a discontinued McDonald's dipping sauce that had been released years earlier to promote the animated film Mulan. He insists he is not driven by avenging his dead family, that the memory of Diane and Beth dying was fake, that the thing pushing him forward is nothing more than a craving for that sauce. He raves that the search will take 9 more seasons, 97 more years, however long it takes, while Morty stares at him in confusion and horror, having no idea what any of it means. This is where the crash hides inside a victory, and it is the most revealing thing about the whole episode. Rick has just won on a scale almost beyond imagining. He destroyed a government, escaped certain death, removed his rival from the household, and installed himself at the center of everything. By any measure of power, he triumphed. And what does he do with the moment? He tells his terrified grandson that none of it was about feeling, that the dead wife was a lie, that the only thing in his enormous heart is a desire for a sauce that no longer exists. The grief gets buried under a galaxy of destruction, and then capped off with a joke about a condiment, which is exactly the same trick the show has been showing since the first season. The catchphrase buried his pain in nonsense sounds. The death ray was hidden from everyone he loved. Here, the pain is hidden under conquest and pettiness, packaged so absurdly that no one, least of all Rick, has to look at it directly. The detail that gives the whole denial its weight is small and easy to miss. When Rick fed the Federation agent the fake memory of his family dying, Morty was not in the room. Morty never saw that memory. So when Rick suddenly insists to Morty that he is not driven by avenging his dead family, he is denying something Morty never even knew to suspect. He is arguing against an accusation no one made. A man does not work that hard to deny a thing unless, somewhere, the thing is true and he cannot bear it. The episode does not explain this. It simply lets the strangeness sit there, a loose thread left hanging on purpose. The kind of thread the show would eventually pull years later to devastating effect. There is a sad joke buried in the way the world responded to the sauce, too. The McDonald's dipping sauce was not random. It was chosen to prove a point about Rick, that he is so petty and so committed to avoiding his real feelings that he will risk the safety of everyone, an entire empire and his own family included, for something that amounts to nothing at all. The point was the emptiness of it. And then, in the real world, fans wanted the sauce so badly that McDonald's brought it back. Crowds gathered, and some restaurants were overwhelmed to the point of chaos by people demanding a condiment they had seen in a cartoon. The joke about an obsession with something worthless became, briefly, a real obsession with something worthless, which only proved how sharp the joke had been. What the Rick Shank Rickdemption shows, beneath all the violence and all the cleverness, is a man who has learned to dress his breakdowns as wins. The first season let his pain peek out through a silly phrase. The second season showed him pointing a weapon at his own head and then trading himself to a prison. The third season opens with him doing the opposite of disappearing, with him conquering everything in reach, and the result is the same haunted person underneath. He cannot grieve, so he rules. He cannot say he is hurt, so he laughs about a sauce. He cannot bear to be known, so he makes sure the one person who glimpses the truth can never be believed. The bodies and the broken marriage and the toppled government are all just the shape his sorrow takes when it has nowhere else to go. Having overturned a galaxy and seized control of his own household, the next crash would be smaller, stranger, and somehow more telling than any explosion. Because shortly after proving he could destroy an entire government to avoid sitting with his feelings, Rick would prove he could not sit still for 1 hour in a quiet office with a therapist either. The man who toppled an empire would turn himself into a pickle rather than answer a few simple questions about his own heart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 3 opened with Rick clawing out of a cell, toppling a galactic government, breaking his own family in half, and then hiding all of it behind a rant about a fast food sauce and a dead wife he swore was never real. The victory was enormous, and the man underneath it was exactly as broken as before. In the next section, that same man chooses to become a pickle rather than sit in a chair and feel something for 1 single hour. Section 4. The Pickle and the Refusal. After the galaxy fell and the family broke apart, what remained was a quieter kind of wreckage. The divorce that Rick had engineered left the household raw and unsettled, with Beth wounded, the children confused, and Rick installed at the center of it all. So Beth did the sensible thing that struggling families do. She booked an appointment with a therapist and decided the whole family would go together, including her father. The stakes could not have been smaller. A small office in a strip mall, a quiet professional, a few simple questions about how everyone was feeling. After watching Rick topple an empire 1 episode earlier, the show pointed its camera at something far more frightening to him, which was a chair, an hour, and the possibility of being honest. The episode is called Pickle Rick. It first aired in 2017 and was written by Ryan Ridley, and it has become one of the most famous and most misunderstood things the show ever made. The premise is exactly what the title says. On the morning the family is supposed to leave for therapy, Rick reveals that he has turned himself into a pickle. He has no spaceship of an excuse and no grand reason. When the family asks why, he says only that he did it to prove that he could, that there was no purpose to it at all. A pickle has no arms and no legs. It cannot walk to an appointment. And so, conveniently, Rick has made himself physically unable to attend the one thing he did not want to attend. The lie does not hold up for long. Morty, lying on the garage floor, notices something odd. There is a syringe of mysterious fluid hanging on a string directly above the spot where Pickle Rick is resting, with the string running through a pair of scissors attached to a timer, and the timer is set to release the syringe at exactly the moment the family would have left for therapy. In plain terms, Rick had built himself a machine that would turn him back into a human the very second it became too late to go. The pickle was not a random experiment. experiment. It was a carefully timed escape, planned in advance, so that Rick could skip therapy and then change back the moment the danger of feeling something had passed. When Morty points out the suspicious timing, Rick brushes the question aside and refuses to explain it, claiming the syringe has nothing to do with the situation. Beth, sensing the trick, takes the syringe with her when she leaves, which strands Rick as a pickle with no way to return to normal. What happens next is one of the most elaborate survival sequences the show has ever animated, and for a long stretch of it, Rick does not speak at all. A cat knocks the helpless pickle off its perch and into the gutter, and Rick is washed down into the sewer, a tiny green thing with no limbs, surrounded by filth and vermin. With nothing but his mind, he begins to build. He kills a cockroach and uses its body. He kills rats, one after another, and assembles their corpses into a crude exoskeleton that he can control with his tongue and his thoughts, turning himself into a small, vicious, rat-powered war machine. The animation does not soften any of this. The killing is precise and quick, and a little sickening to watch, closer to real violence than the cartoon kind, and the show holds on it. Because Rick cannot narrate his cleverness as a pickle, the audience simply watches him be clever, watches the genius work without a single witty line to make it comfortable. The sequence keeps escalating. Rick bursts up out of the sewer and into a foreign government building, and there he turns the same flat, efficient violence on a room full of armed guards. He builds weapons out of whatever he can reach. He moves through the facility, leaving bodies behind him, the same way he moved through the Federation prison in the previous episode, except now he is doing it from inside a body made of dead rats. He encounters a prisoner named Jaguar, a man sent to kill him, and instead of fighting to the death, Rick talks him into an alliance, finding a strange kind of kinship with another lethal and lonely man. Together, they rig the building to explode and escape by helicopter. By the end of his adventure, Rick has survived a fall, an infestation, a small army, and an assassin, and he has done all of it for one reason. He would rather face every one of those things than sit in a chair and answer questions about himself. The show builds the whole episode around this contrast, cutting back and forth between the carnage and the calm. While Rick is drenching himself in rat blood to avoid the appointment, the rest of the family is actually at the appointment, sitting across from the therapist, a woman named Dr. Wong, voiced by Susan Sarandon. The office is quiet and ordinary. There are tissues and a clock and a comfortable chair. Beth spends much of the session defending Rick's absence and steering the conversation toward the children instead of herself. At one point, Beth says that her father does not need anything from anyone, offering it almost as praise. Dr. Wong notices the way Beth says it and observes, gently, that Beth admires him for that. As the session goes on, the therapist begins to suggest something careful and true, that Beth and Rick share the same deep discomfort with emotion and vulnerability, and that this shared coldness may sit at the very root of what is breaking the family apart. Then Rick arrives. He comes to the office at the end, filthy and blood-stained, having clawed his way across half a city in order to retrieve the syringe so he can finally become human again. Before he leaves, the therapist gets a few minutes with him, and Rick uses them to explain exactly why he holds therapy in contempt. He tells her that he does not respect what she does because he is a scientist. He invents and transforms and creates and destroys for a living, and when he does not like something about the world, he simply changes it. He does not believe that sitting in a rented office, listening to someone explain which words match which feelings, has ever helped anyone accomplish anything. He grants that it probably helps a great many people get comfortable and stop panicking, but he describes that calm as a state of mind he values only in the animals raised for food, not something he would ever want for himself. What follows is the moment the whole episode was built around, and it is remarkable for a show whose main character almost always wins every argument. Dr. Wong does not get angry. She does not raise her voice. She simply tells Rick the truth about himself, quietly and without cruelty, and the show does not undercut her with a joke or a clever comeback. She tells him that the only real connection between his enormous intelligence and the sickness tearing his family apart is that everyone in the family, Rick included, uses their intelligence to excuse their sickness. She tells him that he seems to swing back and forth between treating his own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse, and that the one idea he cannot approach is the possibility that his mind is actually within his control. She points out that he chose all of this. He chose to come to the office, chose to talk, chose to belittle her work, in exactly the same way that he chose to turn himself into a pickle. She notes that he is, by his own description, the master of his entire universe, and yet there he sits, dripping with rat blood and waste, his great mind rotting away by his own hand. And then she explains the real reason he avoids the work of healing. Repairing and maintaining and cleaning a life is not an adventure. There is no way to do it so wrong that it might kill him. It is just work. Some people are able to do that quiet work, and some people would genuinely rather die than face it. And each person gets to choose which one they are going to be. Rick says nothing. He stares at her. The animation lingers on his eyes, and it is clear, without a word, that the diagnosis has landed somewhere he cannot defend. For once, the smartest man in any universe has no rebuttal, because the person across from him is not trying to outthink him. She is simply right about him, in a way that no amount of intelligence can argue away. The show, which had spent years letting Rick demolish every opponent, deliberately built a person he could not beat, and made her a therapist in a strip mall. And then, in the most honest and most painful turn of the whole episode, none of it changes anything. On the drive home, Rick apologizes to Beth for lying about the pickle, and he uses the syringe to turn himself back into a human. For a moment, it looks like growth, but the apology is the end of it. Rather than carry the therapist's words home with them, Rick and Beth bond instead by mocking Dr. Wong together, laughing at her and her profession, and deciding to go out drinking rather than think about anything she said. Morty and Summer, who actually connected with the session and wanted to keep going, are simply ignored. The two members of the family who needed the help least are the ones who reject it, and they pull the conversation away from the two who wanted it. In a scene after the credits, when Jaguar shows up to save Rick and Morty from one last threat, Rick tells Morty that this, right here, is the reason a person should never go to therapy. The lesson the therapist offered does not just go unlearned, it gets turned into a punchline. The crash in Pickle Rick is not a suicide attempt or a massacre. It is the refusal itself, performed at an absurd and enormous scale. Rick proved, beyond any doubt, that he would rather fall into a sewer, build a body out of dead rats, slaughter a building full of armed men, and befriend an assassin than sit quietly in a chair for 1 hour and let himself be known. The pickle is the purest version of everything the earlier episodes were showing. The catchphrase was a confession wrapped in nonsense. The death ray was hidden from everyone he loved. The conquest of a galaxy was grief turned into a power move. And the pickle is an entire bloody adventure invented for no reason except to avoid feeling something. An escape so elaborate that it accidentally reveals exactly how much there is to escape from. A man does not go to those lengths to dodge a casual conversation. He goes to those lengths to dodge himself. Dr. Wong named the mechanism precisely, which is why the scene has stayed with so many people. Rick uses his intelligence not as a tool for living, but as a wall against it. The same brilliance that lets him build a portal gun also lets him build 1,000 excuses, 1,000 distractions, 1,000 reasons that the hard and boring work of being a person is beneath him. The adventures are not only adventures, they are avoidance, dressed up in spaceships and lasers and rat armor. Each one is another way of staying busy enough and clever enough and far enough from home that he never has to sit still long enough to feel the weight he carries. It is worth knowing that the episode came from a real place. While the show was being written, the series creator Dan Harmon was going through a divorce of his own and had begun attending therapy, and that experience shaped the episode directly. That is likely why Dr. Wong is allowed to be right, and why the show resists the urge to let Rick win. The therapist is not a punching bag or a fool. She is the voice of the thing the writers themselves were learning, that intelligence is a poor substitute for the simple, unglamorous courage it takes to face a feeling. Rick refuses that courage, and the show lets the refusal stand, without rewarding it and without pretending it is anything other than what it is. Dr. Wong left Rick with one idea above all the others, that the choice was his. Each person gets to decide whether they will do the work or whether they would rather die avoiding it. The remaining seasons of the show would put that idea to the test, slowly and carefully, circling back to the question of whether Rick could ever choose differently. And the answer would arrive through the one thing he chased harder than anything else. The revenge for the family he had sworn in a blood-soaked garage was never real. When that revenge finally came, it would prove the family was real all along, and it would leave him emptier than the sewer ever did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick turned himself into a pickle and survived a sewer, an army, and an assassin, all to avoid one quiet hour in a therapist's chair. And the woman across from him still managed to name exactly what he was running from. The diagnosis landed, and then he laughed it off and went drinking. In the next section, the revenge he swore was fake turns out to be the truest thing about him, and getting it finally breaks him in a way nothing else could. Section 5, the revenge that left him empty. The loose thread from the prison garage was always going to be pulled. In the season 3 premiere, Rick had insisted to Morty that the memory of his dead wife was a fabrication, that he was not driven by avenging his family, that the only thing pushing him forward was a craving for a discontinued sauce. It was a strange strange thing to deny so forcefully to a grandson who had never even seen the memory. For years, the show let that denial sit, unexplained, a small wrongness in the corner of the story. And then, slowly and deliberately, across the 5th season, it began to take the lie apart. The hints came first. Midway through the 5th season, an episode dealing with the rescue of Bird Person's mind revealed that Rick had truly once had a wife who died, and a young daughter taken from him, confirming that the grief at the center of his life was not invented. The full picture arrived in the season finale, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, which first aired in September of 2021. By this point in the story, the version of Morty known as Evil Morty had returned, and he needed something only Rick's mind could give him, a complete scan of Rick's memories, in order to break free of a prison larger than the universe. As part of that scheme, Rick handed Morty a device that played back his own backstory, and for the first time, the audience saw the truth without a filter. The fabricated origin from Season 3 was almost entirely real. A younger Rick had lived a quiet life with his wife Diane and their small daughter Beth. One day, another version of Rick from another dimension appeared in his garage and offered him the secret of traveling between worlds, inviting him to join an endless adventure across the multiverse. The younger Rick declined the offer, saying that a life like that sounded lonely. In retaliation for that rejection, the visiting Rick, a being the show would come to call Rick Prime, dropped a bomb that killed Diane and the young Beth in an instant. Everything the Season 3 Rick had described actually happened. The only part that was a lie was the part where Rick claimed it meant nothing to him. In truth, the murder of his family is what set the entire course of his life. The grieving Rick finished the portal gun on his own and turned his genius toward a single purpose: hunting down Rick Prime and making him pay. After years of that hunt, worn down and hollowed out, Rick eventually drifted into a different version of Earth and slipped quietly into the life of yet another Beth and her children, becoming the grandfather the show follows. The family at the center of the series is the family he found, not the one he lost. The reveal recolors everything that came before it, in the same way the catchphrase reveal did back in the first season. The drinking, the wandering, the refusal to stay anywhere or love anyone too long, all of it sits on top of a single buried wound. The nonsense phrase that secretly means he is in great pain finally has a clear source. The man who topples governments and turns himself into a pickle to avoid an hour of honesty has been carrying the death of his wife and child across every universe he has ever visited. The denial in the garage was not a clever misdirection for the Federation. It was Rick lying to himself, out loud in front of his grandson, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that the smartest being in all of existence had spent his whole life being driven by a grief he could not fix and could not face. For a while, the show let the question hang of whether Rick was still that man. Across the 6th and into the 7th season, the revenge mission often slipped into the background. Rick went on small adventures, bickered with Jerry, returned to old relationships, and seemed, at times, like someone who had let the hunt go cold. The story quietly asked whether the death of Diane still defined him, or whether he had finally moved past it into something more ordinary. The 7th season answered that question in its 5th episode, an installment called Unmortrican, which first aired in November of 2023, and the answer was that the wound had never closed at all. Rick Prime had not gone away either. He had been moving through the multiverse, capturing and killing Ricks, including destroying the hidden refuges that the show's Rick had built for himself, leaving him with nowhere safe to retreat. The episode brings the long hunt to a head. Through a recorded message, Rick Prime reveals the full scale of his cruelty. Using an all-powerful weapon called the Omega device, he had killed Diane not just in one universe, but across every dimension at once, erasing her everywhere she had ever existed, purely to spite the one Rick who had dared to come after him. Rick Prime then traps a crowd of captured Ricks in a deadly game, promising that the last one standing will get a chance to bring Diane back. Our Rick knows it is a lie, and says so, but the other Ricks fall on each other anyway, killing one another in desperate hope, until only the show's Rick remains. The trap then produces a killing machine wearing Diane's face, which Rick, Morty, and Evil Morty have to destroy together. They escape the self-destructing prison, and using the last of a portal fluid trail, Rick finally pinpoints the true location of Rick Prime. The confrontation itself is stripped of all the spectacle the show usually loves. Evil Morty, before leaving, takes the plans for the Omega device and destroys the weapon. And he warns Morty plainly that simply letting Rick kill Rick Prime will not fix anything. By the time Rick reaches his enemy, Rick Prime has been beaten down, bound to a chair, and stripped of his power, helpless. There is no grand duel between two godlike geniuses. Rick simply kills him with his bare hands, beating the man who murdered his wife to death in a slow, brutal, deeply personal act of violence. The thing he has chased across a lifetime and a multiverse, the single goal that shaped every choice he ever made, is finally finished. Rick Prime is dead, and Rick feels nothing. As the act ends, evil Morty asks him a simple question: whether he feels better now that it is done. Rick has no answer. The revenge that was supposed to fill the hole in him does not fill anything. It leaves him cold and empty, standing over a corpse with the one purpose that organized his entire existence suddenly gone, and nothing rising up to replace it. The kill does not heal him. It hollows him out further. The way the show scores this moment is the quiet masterstroke that ties the whole story together. Over the scene of Rick returning to his ordinary life after the killing, the show plays a soft and aching song by the band Mazzy Star called "Look On Down From the Bridge." That is the exact same song that played in the very first season, in the episode where Morty buried his own dead body in the backyard and tried to settle into a stolen life in a stolen universe. The series planted that song a decade earlier, over a child learning to carry an unbearable truth, and it brings it back here, over a grandfather discovering that the truth he chased for a lifetime was never going to set him free. The same melody bookends the same lesson. Some wounds cannot be solved by being clever, or by being powerful, or by winning. They can only be carried. The series creator Dan Harmon described what the killing did to Rick in terms that make the emptiness explicit. With the revenge complete, Rick became the one who is existentially isolated, the one who no longer feels he fits into the universe around him. For most of the show, Rick had been the one standing outside everything, looking down on the people who needed meaning and purpose. Now he had spent his meaning. The hunt had given him a reason to keep going, a shape for all his pain, and once it was gone, he was left as the loneliest version of himself, a man who got everything he wanted and found that it was nothing. The episode makes its point one more time, gently, after the credits. A minor character named Slow Mobius had been killed earlier by Rick Prime's weapon, erased from all of existence. In the closing scene, Slow Mobius's widow sets out on a quest for revenge that looks exactly like Rick's, searching the galaxy for the one who took her husband, consumed by the same fury. But her story bends in the opposite direction. Along the way, she meets another grieving being who lost a partner the same way, and instead of chasing vengeance to its empty end, the two of them choose each other. They settle down, raise their families together, and move forward while still keeping the memory of the ones they lost. She breaks the cycle of revenge. Rick completes it. The show places these two paths side by side on purpose. The widow who let go and lived, and the genius who held on and was hollowed out, so that no one can miss what it is saying about the price of the choice Rick made. Looking back across the first half of this story, a single shape comes into focus. There was the catchphrase that secretly begged for help while everyone laughed. There was the death ray in the garage on the night Unity left. There was the surrender to a prison framed as love. There was the conquest of a galaxy and the rant about a sauce, grief disguised as a power move. There was the pickle, an entire bloody adventure invented to dodge one honest hour. And now there is the revenge, the longest and most personal crash of all. Every one of these was the same man avoiding the same grief, just wearing a different costume each time. The death of Diane was always underneath, the engine beneath the drinking and the cruelty and the running. The final crash is the cruelest precisely because it is the one where Rick succeeds. In every earlier breakdown, he was avoiding the pain, outrunning it, burying it under jokes and bodies and science. With Rick Prime, he finally turned and faced the source of it directly, and he won the fight completely, and the victory gave him nothing at all. Dr. Wong had told him that maintaining a life is just work, unglamorous and safe, and that some people would rather die than do it. The revenge was the grandest possible version of choosing to die avoiding the work. Rick poured a lifetime of genius into the most dangerous, most dramatic, most adventurous solution to his grief that the universe could offer, and it turned out the boring, frightening, ordinary path the therapist described, the one with no explosions and no enemy to punch, was the only one that ever could have helped. He chose the adventure. The adventure left him empty. That is where the catalog of crashes ends, and where a deeper question begins. A man does not live this way, does not break this way over and over, without some belief holding it all together, some understanding of the world that makes the running feel reasonable. To understand why Rick Sanchez keeps choosing the explosion over the quiet work, it is not enough to list what he did. It becomes necessary to look at what the show itself believes about the universe, the cold idea it has been whispering underneath the comedy since the very beginning. And the clearest statement of that idea was not spoken by Rick at all. It was spoken by a 13-year-old boy sitting on a bed trying to comfort his sister in the bleakest line the series has ever delivered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The revenge Rick swore was fake turned out to be the truest thing about him, and beating his wife's killer to death gave him nothing but a deeper emptiness, scored to the same sad song that played over a buried body in the very first season. Every crash, in the end, was the same grief wearing a new disguise. In the next section, the focus turns from what Rick did to what the show actually believes, beginning with the coldest sentence it ever spoke aloud. Section 6. Nobody exists on purpose. There's an image from the first season that the show never lets the audience fully shake. A boy sits at a kitchen table eating breakfast, and a short distance away, just outside the window, buried under the dirt of the backyard, is his own dead body. He passes it every morning. He has learned to live beside it. The show treats this not as a nightmare, but as a fact of ordinary life, something the boy mentions almost calmly, and that calm is more disturbing than any scream could be. To understand why Rick Sanchez breaks the way he breaks, it helps to step away from the man himself for a moment and look instead at the universe he lives in, and at the quiet, cold idea the show keeps placing underneath all of its noise. Everything in this series rests on a single premise. There is not one universe, but an endless number of them, branching off from every choice, every accident, every roll of the dice, forever. For every version of a person who made one decision, there is another version who made the opposite one, and another, stretching out past counting. Rick's portal gun makes this idea casual and physical. He can step from one reality to the next the way a person steps from one room to another. In his hands, the infinite is not a grand mystery to be approached with awe. It is a tool used to escape a bad situation or to find a better version of something he wants. The show builds its whole sense of scale on this, and that scale quietly poisons the idea that anything could ever truly matter. The episode that states this most plainly is from the first season, an installment called Ricksty Minutes, which aired in early 2014. The setup begins as comedy. Rick produces a pair of goggles that let the family peer into the lives of their alternate selves across other dimensions. A kind of television tuned not to shows, but to roads not taken. Jerry puts them on and sees a version of himself who became a famous movie star, living a glamorous life he never reached in this reality. Beth puts them on and sees a version of herself who became a real surgeon for people, rather than a surgeon for horses, a woman who chased her ambition and caught it. The goggles show each of them the person they might have been if their lives had broken differently, and for the parents, it is intoxicating and a little heartbreaking to watch. Then Summer puts them on, and the comedy curdles. She searches through the dimensions for the other versions of herself, and she discovers something that no person should ever have to learn. In most realities, Summer does not exist at all. The versions where she does exist are largely unchanged by her presence, as if her being there or not being there makes almost no difference to anything. Pressed for an explanation, Jerry and Beth confess the truth. Summer was an unwanted pregnancy. They had planned to end it, and only chance and circumstance led to her being born. And her birth is the thing that derailed the lives the goggles had just shown them, the movie star and the surgeon they never got to be. Summer is forced to see, laid out across infinite worlds, the simple and brutal arithmetic of her own existence. She was an accident, and the accident cost her parents their dreams. And in the realities where the accident never happened, the universe rolled on perfectly well without her. Devastated, Summer goes upstairs and begins to pack her bags to run away. And here the show makes the move that defines its entire philosophy. Morty follows her, and instead of comforting her the way an ordinary sibling would, with a kind lie or a sweet memory, he tells her the most despairing truth he knows. He reminds her that he and Rick once destroyed their original world by accident, that they abandoned that ruined reality and crossed into this one because here the world was intact, and here the original Rick and Morty had died. He confesses that he and his grandfather buried those dead bodies in the yard and stepped into their lives, and that he is not, in fact, Summer's real brother. Her real brother is rotting in the ground a few yards from where the family eats. And then he offers her the only comfort he has. He tells her that nobody exists on purpose, that nobody belongs anywhere, that everybody is going to die, and he asks her, gently, to come downstairs and watch television with him. The astonishing thing is that it works. Summer is consoled. The bleakest sentence the series has ever spoken, delivered by a 13-year-old boy to his frightened sister, lands not as cruelty but as kindness, and she puts down her bags and goes with him. The two of them walk back downstairs and settle onto the couch to watch the endless channels of other realities, and the episode lets the moment rest in a strange, quiet peace. The horror of the scene is not in any image. It is in the fact that despair is the thing that calms her, that the cure for the pain of being an accident is the discovery that everyone and everything is equally accidental, equally pointless, equally doomed. The logic underneath the comfort is worth sitting with, because it is the logic the whole show runs on. Summer's specific pain comes from feeling singled out, from believing that her existence is uniquely unwanted, a mistake that ruined the people who made her. Morty does not argue with that. He simply expands it until it stops being personal. If nobody exists on purpose, then Summer's accidental birth is not a special shame. It is just the ordinary condition of everything that has ever lived. If nobody belongs anywhere, then her feeling of not belonging is not a flaw in her. It is the truth about every creature in every universe. The nihilism does not deny her pain. It dissolves it by making it universal, by zooming so far out that her small tragedy disappears into the vast and even meaninglessness of all things. Being nothing special is unbearable until you realize that nothing is special, and then, somehow, it becomes a kind of relief. This is the show offering despair as medicine, and it is the foundation of everything Rick does. When a person truly believes that the multiverse is infinite, certain conclusions follow, and they are the exact conclusions Rick lives by. No single life can be precious, because there are endless copies of it elsewhere. No loss can be permanent, because somewhere another version of the lost thing still exists. No choice can carry real weight, because every possible choice is being made by some other version of you at the same moment, which means your particular decision changes almost nothing about the whole. The very episode that delivers the nihilist creed reminds the audience that Rick once destroyed an entire planet and simply walked into a fresh one, treating a dead world as a thing to be swapped out rather than mourned. The infinite universes are not just the show's setting, they are the engine of its nihilism, the reason a man like Rick can shrug at consequences that would shatter anyone else. The symbol the show chooses for all of this is perfect and quietly damning. It is television. The family does not respond to the revelation of infinite realities with wonder or terror or a search for meaning. They sit on the couch and watch it, channel after channel, life after life, the way a tired person scrolls through something to numb the evening. The interdimensional cable, with its endless absurd programs and its glimpses into other selves, is the multiverse reduced to content. Infinite possibility, flattened into something to stare at passively while the mind goes quiet. And it is not only Morty and Summer. In the same episode, Beth lies on the kitchen floor with the goggles still strapped to her face, refusing to take them off, lost in the life of the surgeon she never became, choosing the comfort of a reality that is not hers over the one she actually has to live in. The whole family copes the same way, by checking out of their own existence and into the endless others. The drinking, the goggles, the television, the portal hopping, they are all the same gesture, a way of not being fully present in a life that the philosophy insists does not matter anyway. What makes this idea sit so heavily is that the show almost never argues against it directly. It does not pause to reassure the audience that meaning is real, that love is worth it, that the nihilism is a phase the characters will grow out of. It presents the cold view as the clear-eyed one, the adult one, the thing the smart characters understand and the foolish ones have not yet faced. Rick is the smartest being in any universe, and Rick believes that nothing matters, and the show lets that pairing imply something uncomfortable, that intelligence and despair travel together, that the more clearly a person sees the true shape of an infinite and indifferent reality, the harder it becomes to pretend that any of it means a thing. The series dresses this in jokes and color and chaos, but the idea underneath is patient and grim, and it never quite goes away. And yet, even here, in the purest statement of the show's hopelessness, something does not add up, and that something is the thread the rest of this story will follow. Look closely at the scene that delivers the creed. Morty tells Summer that nobody belongs anywhere and nothing matters, but he tells her this while trying to keep her from running away. He wants his sister to stay. He cares whether she leaves. The boy reciting the gospel of meaninglessness is, in the very same breath, performing an act that only makes sense if connection matters, if family matters, if her staying is somehow better than her going. Summer hears the words about universal doom, and what she takes from them is not a reason to give up, but a reason to remain, to sit beside her brother on the couch, to choose the small and pointless company of a family that is not even biologically hers. The philosophy says nothing matters. The behavior of everyone in the scene says that something does, quietly, stubbornly, in spite of the philosophy. That gap is the most important thing in the entire series, and it is the place where the show stops being a simple story about a nihilist and becomes something stranger and sadder. The characters speak the language of meaninglessness fluently. They reach for it as comfort, wield it as wisdom, hide behind it when feeling becomes too much, but they cannot actually live inside it. They keep choosing each other. They keep coming back. They keep acting again and again as though things matter, while insisting with their words that nothing does. The nihilism is real as a belief and false as a way of life, and the distance between the two is where all the show's pain lives. No one embodies that distance more completely than Rick. He is the loudest voice for the idea that nothing matters, the one who states it with the most confidence and the most cruelty, the one who built his whole identity around seeing through every illusion that ordinary people cling to. He has the portal gun. He has the infinite universes at his fingertips. He has every reason and every tool to live as though nothing is precious and nothing can be lost. And his entire life, every crash cataloged in the first half of this story, is a long and helpless demonstration that he does not believe it for a second. A man who truly thought nothing mattered would not have built a death ray over a breakup. He would not have spent a lifetime hunting the one who killed his wife. He would not have been left hollow by a revenge that, in a meaningless universe, should have meant nothing at all. The show says nobody exists on purpose. The man at its center says it the loudest, the most often, with the most certainty. And everything he does, every choice, and every breakdown, quietly says the opposite. The next section steps into that contradiction and stays there, because it is not a flaw in the writing or an inconsistency the show forgot to fix. It is the secret at the heart of Rick Sanchez, the thing that explains the drinking and the running and the grief all at once. He does not believe nothing matters. He needs it to be true, because the alternative is something he cannot survive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show's coldest idea, that nobody exists on purpose and nothing means anything, was offered to a frightened girl as comfort, and the unsettling part is that it worked. Yet even as the family recited the gospel of meaninglessness, every one of them kept choosing connection, acting as though something mattered after all. In the next section, that contradiction settles onto Rick himself, the man who needs nihilism to be true because the alternative would destroy him. Section 7. The man who needs nihilism to be true. The simplest way to describe this series is to call it a nihilist show about a nihilist man. And that description is repeated so often that it has hardened into common knowledge. Rick says nothing matters. He says it drunk and he says it sober. Says it to his grandson and says it to the universe. Says it with a confidence that sounds like the final word on the subject. A character who declares the meaninglessness of all things that clearly, that frequently, seems easy to file away. But the words are the least reliable evidence in the entire show. To take Rick at his word about his own beliefs is to make exactly the mistake he wants everyone to make, which is to look at the philosophy he announces and never at the life he actually lives. And the life tells a completely different story. Begin at the beginning, with the single most revealing choice Rick ever made, the one buried in his origin. Before the drinking, before the portal gun, before any of the despair, a younger Rick stood in his garage and was offered the entire multiverse. Another version of himself, a being with the power to travel between infinite worlds, invited him into a life of endless adventure across endless realities. This was the nihilist's paradise being handed to him on a plate. Infinite everything. Nothing precious, because everything exists in countless copies. No loss that cannot be undone by hopping one universe over. If Rick truly believed that nothing matters, this was the offer that matched the belief perfectly, and he turned it down. He said no, because a life like that sounded lonely. He chose to stay with one wife and one small daughter in one finite, fragile life, because those particular people mattered to him more than infinity did. That is not the choice of a man who believes nothing matters. It is the opposite. It is the choice of a man who believed completely that some things matter more than everything else. Then those things were taken from him. Rick Prime murdered Diane and the young Beth, and what happened next is the clearest proof of all. A genuine nihilist, faced with the death of his family, would have grieved briefly and moved on, or not grieved at all, because in a meaningless universe, one dead wife among infinite wives is a statistical nothing. There are countless other Dianes in countless other worlds. A person who actually held the philosophy Rick preaches would have shrugged, opened a portal, and found a reality where she still lived. That is not what Rick did. The loss did not slide off him. It broke him, and it kept breaking him, and it organized the entire remainder of his existence around a single act of vengeance that took a lifetime and a multiverse to complete. He could not move on. He could not let it go. He devoted his unmatched genius to hunting one specific killer for one specific death, which is the behavior of a man for whom that death mattered more than anything in all of infinity. The grief is the evidence. You do not grieve like that for something that does not matter. The order of events is the key to the whole puzzle. Rick was not born a nihilist who then happened to lose his family. He was a man man who loved a family, lost them violently, and only afterward became the detached, sneering, nothing matters figure the audience meets in the first episode. The philosophy did not come first and shape his life. The loss came first, and the philosophy grew over the wound like scar tissue. Read in that order, the nihilism stops looking like a conclusion Rick reached through his superior intelligence and starts looking like something far more human and far sadder. It looks like armor. It looks like the thing a person tells himself when the truth is too heavy to carry any other way. Consider how the armor actually works, because it is elegant in the cruel way that intelligent self-deception always is. If nothing matters, then Diane's death does not matter. If her death does not matter, then the agony Rick feels about it is not a reasonable response to a real and terrible loss, but merely chemistry, a malfunction, noise in the machine that can be ignored or drowned in alcohol. Nihilism gives Rick permission to hold his grief at arm's length, to treat the worst thing that ever happened to him as cosmically unimportant, which makes it survivable. The infinite universes help the trick along. If there are endless versions of Diane out there, then the one he lost was nothing special, just one card in an infinite deck, and a man should not break his heart over a single card. Rick tells himself this. He builds a whole world view around telling himself this. The problem is that no part of him believes it, and the show keeps showing the cracks. The cracks are everywhere once a person knows to look. The catchphrase is a crack, a constant low broadcast of pain leaking out in a voice he made silly so no one would hear the words. A man at genuine peace with a meaningless universe does not walk around secretly announcing over and over that he is in great pain and needs help. The drinking is a crack, because numbing yourself only makes sense if there is something there to numb. And Rick numbs himself constantly, relentlessly, like a man holding a door shut against something behind it. The suicide attempt in the garage is the largest crack of all. A person cannot be driven to try to end his own life by the meaninglessness of existence, because if existence were truly meaningless, its end would be meaningless too. Suicide is not the act of someone who feels nothing. It is the act of someone who feels far too much, for whom the weight of meaning, the unbearable significance of loss and loneliness, has become impossible to keep carrying. Rick tried to die because things mattered to him so much that living with their absence felt impossible. That is the testimony of his own hand on the machine. Dr. Wong, the therapist who saw through him in a single session, named the mechanism without ever needing the backstory. She told Rick that he uses his intelligence to justify his sickness, and the nihilism is precisely that, the intellectual justification for the sickness of avoidance. A less clever man who could not bear his grief might simply drink and call it weakness. Rick, being the smartest being in any universe, cannot allow his avoidance to look like weakness, so he dresses it up as insight. He does not run from his feelings because he is afraid, he tells himself. He ignores his feelings because he has seen through the illusion of meaning that lesser minds cling to. The genius does not protect him from the cowardice. It gives the cowardice a costume sophisticated enough that even he is fooled. His intelligence and his despair are not the same thing, though the show sometimes lets them look that way. His despair is not the clear sight of a brilliant mind. It is a wound wearing the clothes of wisdom. The single sharpest tell is the denial in the garage, the Szechuan sauce rant. After clawing out of prison, Rick told Morty that he was not driven by avenging his dead family, that the memory was fake, that the only thing pushing him forward was a craving for a discontinued fast food sauce. Morty had never even seen the memory of Diane. No one had accused Rick of being driven by grief, so why deny it? Why argue so forcefully and so strangely against a charge that no one had made? A man only works that hard to deny something when the something is true and the truth is unbearable. The denial was not aimed at Morty. It was aimed inward. A man insisting to himself that the love and the loss meant nothing, that his life was about a condiment and not about a murdered wife, because the condiment is survivable and the wife is not. He chose the most absurd, most worthless possible motive he could name, specifically because its absurdity proved he was above caring. It was the philosophy in its purest form, a man laughing about a sauce so he would not have to weep about Diane. And then the revenge finally came, and it disproved the philosophy completely. When Rick beat Rick Prime to death, the long mission was over, and in a meaningless universe, the completion of a meaningless task should have produced exactly nothing, no relief and no loss, because nothing mattered to begin with. Instead, it hollowed him out. The emptiness Rick felt after the kill is the final piece of evidence, and it points in only one direction. A true nihilist feels nothing after revenge, because there was never anything to feel. Rick felt nothing after revenge because he had been secretly hoping, underneath all the denial, that killing the man who took his family would give the loss some meaning, some resolution, some closing of the wound, and it did not. The emptiness was not indifference. It was disappointed grief. He had wanted the revenge to matter and discovered that even getting it could not bring back the thing that actually mattered, which was Diane, who was gone in every universe at once. A man who believed nothing matters could not be disappointed by a meaningless victory. Only a man who desperately wanted something to matter could be hollowed out by getting exactly what he asked for and finding it empty. The series creator has spoken about Rick in terms that line up with this reading. In describing the aftermath of the revenge, Dan Harmon framed Rick as someone who became the truly isolated one, who no longer felt he fit into the universe around him, and as a man more invested, consciously, in his own destruction than in anything else. That is not a portrait of a contented nihilist who has made peace with the void. It is a portrait of a person at war with himself, who has spent his genius building reasons not to feel and corners to hide in, and who is slowly, deliberately taking himself apart. The philosophy of meaninglessness, in that light, is not Rick's peace. It is one of the weapons he uses against himself. Here, then, is the truest version of who Rick Sanchez is, the reading that all the evidence supports, even though Rick himself would deny it to his last breath. He is not a nihilist who happens to be sad. He is a man who feels everything, too much, more than he can bear, and who adopted nihilism because it was the only framework that let him keep functioning while carrying that much loss. He needs nothing to matter, because the alternative is intolerable. If things matter, then Diane mattered, and her death was a real and permanent catastrophe rather than a cosmic shrug. If things matter, then Beth and Summer and Morty matter, which means he loves them, which means he is exposed all over again to the exact kind of loss that already nearly killed him once. If things matter, then his grief is justified, and his pain is real, and he has been right to hurt this badly for this long, and that is a sentence he cannot serve. Believing nothing matters is the only way he has found to stay alive inside his own heart. The nihilism was never a conclusion about the universe. It was always a strategy for surviving himself. That is what makes the show so much heavier than its reputation suggests. It is not a story celebrating the cool emptiness of a genius who sees through everything. It is a story about a deeply loving man pretending, for years, across infinite realities, that he is not, because the love is the thing that broke him and might break him again. Every crash in the first half of this story, the catchphrase and the death ray and the conquest and the pickle and the revenge, is the same man failing, over and over, to actually believe the thing he most needs to believe. He says nothing matters, and then he keeps acting like everything does. And the gap between the saying and the acting is the most honest thing about him. But there is a question this reading leaves open, and it leads somewhere even darker than Rick's private grief. If the multiverse is the tool Rick uses to prove that nothing is special, then there is something strange about Rick's place within it that the show waited years to explain. In every reality, across every version of events, Rick is the smartest being there is. The infinite seems to bend itself around him, to make him exceptional everywhere at once, which is a deeply odd thing for the infinite to do. The answer, when it finally arrives, is the most unsettling piece of lore in the entire series, and it suggests that the meaningless multiverse Rick hides inside was, in a terrible way, shaped by Rick himself. He did not just find a cage, he built one, and he built it to stay special. And the next section is about what that cage costs. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick declared that nothing matters, then chose love over infinity, broke beyond repair when that love was taken, and was hollowed out by the very revenge that should have meant nothing to a true nihilist. The philosophy was never his conclusion about the universe, only his armor against a grief he could not survive feeling. In the next section, that infinite universe turns out to bend strangely around him, and the reason why is the darkest thing he ever built. Section 8. The Central Finite Curve. There is a question hiding underneath this series that most people never think to ask, because the show makes the answer feel obvious. Rick is the smartest being in the universe. Everyone says it. The aliens say it, the other Ricks say it, the show itself says it, and Rick certainly says it. But the show is built on infinite realities, and in a truly infinite multiverse, that claim cannot possibly be true. Among an endless number of universes, there must be endless versions of Rick who are stupid, who failed, who never built a portal gun, who died young, who were ordinary men with ordinary lives. The infinite contains everything, which means it contains a million Ricks who are nobody at all. And yet, across hundreds of adventures and dozens of dimensions, the audience never meets a single one of them. Every Rick the show has ever shown sits at the top. The infinite somehow bends itself to make one man supreme everywhere at once, and the show waited 5 seasons to explain why. The answer arrives in the 5th season finale, Rick Mirai Jack, and it is the single most unsettling piece of lore the series ever produced. It is called the Central Finite Curve. In plain terms, it is a wall built around infinity. At some point in the distant past, a group of Ricks took the true endless multiverse with all its countless versions of every possible life, and they carved out of it only the universes that shared one specific trait, the universes in which Rick is the smartest being alive. They sealed that curated collection off from everything else and locked themselves inside it. Every reality this show has ever visited, every Earth, every adventure, every version of the family exists inside that walled garden. The portal gun, the device that seemed to grant access to all of infinity, only ever traveled within the boundaries of the curve. Rick's green portals could reach any universe at all, as long as it was a universe where Rick was already guaranteed to win. The show describes the arrangement with an image that is hard to forget once it lands. The Ricks built a wall around infinity, separating every universe in existence from every universe where Rick is the smartest man. And the result is that every version of every Rick and every Morty has spent every version of their entire lives inside a single enormous crib. A crib built around one infinite, all-important baby. That baby is Rick. The whole curated multiverse, with its illusion of endless possibility, is a nursery designed around the ego of one man, a place engineered so that he can never encounter a reality where he is not the center of everything. The infinite was not too large for Rick to dominate. It was simply trimmed down, walled off, and rebuilt into a shape small enough for him to rule. The question of who built it is where the lore becomes personal, and where the show grows deliberately careful. The series strongly implicates our Rick, the one called C-137, as the architect, or at least the chief mind behind the curve, though it was constructed alongside the precursors of what would become the Council of Ricks. The most convincing reading the evidence supports is that he built it during his hunt for Rick Prime. Faced with the impossible task of searching an infinite multiverse for one specific killer, a clever solution presents itself. Narrow the search. Wall off every universe except the ones where a Rick is the smartest being, because Rick Prime, being a Rick, would be hiding in one of those. To find his enemy in infinity, Rick shrank infinity down to a manageable size, and in doing so, he accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, built a kingdom in which he was guaranteed to be God. He led a campaign of staggering violence to do it, killing other Ricks by the millions, before a peace was brokered and the council was formed and the curve was set spinning. He failed to catch Rick Prime that way, but the cage remained, and although our Rick eventually lost interest in the project and walked away from the Citadel in disgust, the other Ricks kept the machine running, generation after generation, because none of them could bear to give up the guarantee of being the most powerful thing in every world they could touch. The cost of this arrangement falls hardest on the Mortys, and this is the darkest part of the entire revelation. Inside the curve, the Mortys are not really grandsons. They are accessories. They are bred to serve, used as cover and as shields, kept close not out of love but out of usefulness. The show makes clear that a Morty who develops genuine free will, who wants something for himself, who refuses to orbit his Rick, is the thing that Ricks consider evil. Across the walled multiverse, countless Mortys have lived and died as little more than equipment in service of one man's need to feel supreme. Generation after generation of children trapped inside an old man's god complex, never knowing that the universe they lived in was a stage built to make their grandfather look like the smartest being in creation. They were not even allowed to know the wall existed. To every Morty, and every family, and every alien race they met, Rick simply was the top of the food chain, because every universe where he was not had been quietly hidden away behind a barrier they could never see or cross. Now hold this revelation up against everything the previous section established, and watch the contradiction at the heart of Rick deepen into something almost unbearable. In public, in every drunken speech, Rick insists that nothing matters, that he is nothing special, that he is just one Rick among infinite Ricks in an indifferent void. He uses the vastness of the multiverse as proof of his own insignificance, as the reason no loss should hurt and no life should be precious. But the multiverse he actually travels in is not the indifferent infinite. It is a cage he built specifically to guarantee that he is the most special being in every single reality he can reach. The man who claims he is nothing special has rigged existence itself so that he is always, without a single exception, the most important important person alive. The nihilism is spoken from inside a kingdom engineered for his supremacy. He is not staring into an uncaring void and bravely accepting that he does not matter. He is sitting on a throne he constructed, in a universe he curated, telling everyone that thrones are meaningless. The two cages turn out to be the same shape. In the previous section, the nihilism revealed itself as armor over grief, a way of insisting that nothing matters so that the loss of Diane would not have to matter. Here it reveals itself as armor over its opposite as well, over a colossal and fragile ego that cannot survive in a universe where Rick might not be the best. A man who truly believed he was insignificant would not need to wall off infinity to avoid meeting a better version of himself. He builds that wall precisely because the possibility of not being supreme is as intolerable to him as the possibility that his grief was real. So he can afford his nihilism. He can lounge in it, perform it, weaponize it, because he has secretly arranged a reality in which he always wins. The despair and the God complex are not opposites. They are two walls of the same crib, both built to keep the real and frightening universe, the one where things matter and where he might be ordinary, safely on the other side. Only one character ever saw the wall for what it was and refused to live behind it. Evil Morty. The version of Morty the show is treated as its great recurring villain, is the one being who looked at the arrangement clearly and rejected it completely. He was an alternate Morty, sick to death of being an accessory to his Rick's ego, and rather than accept the role he was bred for, he built a device to control his Rick, and then devoted his entire existence to a single goal that no other Morty had even imagined was possible. He wanted out. He wanted to escape the central finite curve, to reach the part of the true multiverse where Rick was not automatically the smartest, the strongest, the center of everything. To get there, he was ruthless, rising to become president of the Citadel of Ricks, using crowds of other Mortys as shields, killing whoever stood between him and freedom. The show frames him as evil, and by the body count he earns the name. But his actual crime, the thing that made him evil in the eyes of the Ricks, was wanting free will. His sin was the desire to exist somewhere that was not built around an old man. In the closing moments of the 5th season, having extracted the last piece of information he needed from Rick's own mind, Evil Morty blasted a portal through the wall of the curve and walked out into the true infinite beyond, the realities no Rick had ever permitted himself to reach. His portal glowed a different color than Rick's, a small visual mark of a boundary that had finally been crossed. A door opened onto the parts of existence Rick had spent a lifetime sealing shut. What lies beyond that wall, the show has never shown. Evil Morty stepped into the real multiverse and largely vanished from the story. And the question of what exists out there, in the universes where Rick is not God, hangs over everything that came after, unanswered and quietly enormous. The other Ricks, unable to tolerate even the idea of a broken wall, set about restoring the arrangement because the need to be supreme outlived even the man who first built the cage. And the deepest question the revelation leaves behind is not about cosmology at all. It is about the show's central relationship. If the Mortys were bred and trapped and used as accessories to a Rick's hunger to be God, then the bond at the very heart of this series, between this particular old man and this particular boy, is built on ground far less solid than it appears. The thing the show always presented as the one real connection in Rick's life sits inside a structure designed to deny Mortys any reality of their own. The central finite curve, in the end, is the physical shape of Rick's mind made visible. A man who could not bear his grief built a philosophy in which nothing matters, so that the worst thing that ever happened to him could be filed away as meaningless. And a man who could not bear the possibility of being ordinary built a literal wall around infinity, so that he would never have to meet the version of himself who was. Both are prisons disguised as freedom. Both keep the unbearable truth that things matter and that he is not the center of everything, locked safely outside. The portal gun that looked like the ultimate symbol of limitless possibility turns out to be a key that only opens doors inside the cell. Rick spent the whole series acting like a man who had seen all of infinity and found it empty, when in truth he had only ever seen the small, curated corner of it that he built to flatter himself, and then mistaken his own crib for the universe. But every wall has a weak point, and the weakest point in Rick's runs straight through the one person he claims to love. Because if the Mortys are accessories, and the families across the curated multiverse are interchangeable, and Rick himself once buried his own dead body and stepped into a stranger's life without blinking, then a terrible question begins to form around the people he lives with now. The daughter at his kitchen table, the grandchildren on his adventures. The next section is about the most disturbing, unresolved mystery the show ever planted and then refused to fully answer. The question of which Beth is the real one, and the even colder possibility reality that not even Rick knows. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The reason Rick is the smartest in every universe is that he built a wall around infinity, sealing off a curated crib of realities where he could never fail to be supreme, and trapping countless Mortys inside it as accessories to his ego. The man who preaches that nothing matters secretly engineered a kingdom where he always wins. In the next section, that cold logic of replaceable people turns toward his own family and the question of which Beth is real. Section 9. Which Beth is real? Somewhere in Rick's garage, there is a recording of the most important decision he ever made about his daughter, and Rick deliberately arranged things so that even he could never know what the recording shows. This is the strangest and quietest horror the series ever planted, and it sits right at the center of the family the show keeps insisting is the one real thing in Rick's life. The man who walls off infinity to stay supreme, who treats the multiverse as a drawer of spare parts, eventually turned that same logic on his own child, and the result is a mystery the show has never once tried to solve. It began in the third season, in an episode called The ABCs of Beth. Rick's daughter had come to understand that she carried something of her father inside her, a darkness, a restlessness, a hunger for something more than the small life she was living. She wanted to leave, to go off into the cosmos and become someone unbound by family and routine. But she could not bring herself to simply choose it. Instead, she put the choice in Rick's hands, and she asked him the most direct and vulnerable question a daughter can ask a parent. She wanted to know whether he wanted her to stay and be part of his life, or whether he wanted her to go. For once, she asked him to be the one to decide. Rick did not answer her. To answer would have meant admitting whether he loved her enough to want her to stay, and that admission was exactly the kind of feeling he has spent his entire existence avoiding. So he did what he always does when a feeling becomes too dangerous. He turned it into an engineering problem. He knocked Beth unconscious and made a clone of her, an identical copy with identical memories up to that moment, so that one Beth could fly off into space to live the adventurous life she craved, while another Beth stayed home with the family. And then he did something stranger still. He swapped the two of them around at random, repeatedly, and looked away while he did it, scrambling the order until he no longer knew which Beth was the original and which was the copy. He erased his own knowledge on purpose, recording the truth into a memory device and then refusing to keep it in his head. The consequences arrived a full season later, in the fourth season finale, Star Mort Return of the Jerry, which aired in 2020. By then, one Beth had been living quietly at home with the family, while the other, known as Space Beth, had become a feared rebel warrior fighting across the galaxy. Space Beth returns to Earth after a doctor discovers a device implanted in her neck, a discovery that makes her believe she is the clone, the disposable copy, and she comes home furious and wanting answers. What she finds is a father who cannot give them. Rick flip-flops shamelessly throughout the episode, telling Space Beth that she is the clone, then telling the Earth Beth that she is the clone, claiming whichever thing is convenient in the moment, because the simple truth is that he does not know. At the end of the episode, he retrieves the memory device and finally watches the recording of what he did, and it confirms the worst of it. He genuinely erased his own knowledge. He cannot tell which of his daughters is the woman he raised and which is the thing he grew in a vat. And when the family is given the chance to learn the truth, not one of them wants to know. The horror deepens once a person remembers what came before. Even the Beth who stayed home was never Rick's original daughter to begin with. The original Beth, the little girl, died alongside Diane in the bombing that started everything. The Beth the show follows came from a different dimension entirely, the replacement reality Rick moved into long ago. The same kind of swap Morty made when he buried his own body in the yard. So the daughter at Rick's kitchen table was already a substitute for a child he lost. And now, on top of that, she is possibly a clone of that substitute, a copy of a replacement of a dead girl. The layers of non-originality stack up until the question of who is the real Beth stops having any floor to stand on. There may not be a real one left to find. This is where Rick's philosophy collides with the one relationship it was never supposed to touch. For most of the series, the idea that people are interchangeable is a convenience, a way to shrug off loss, a tool for treating the universe as disposable. But a daughter is not supposed to be disposable, and the show forces Rick to apply his cold logic to the one person it should never reach. Faced with the simple question about love, whether he wanted his child in his life, Rick could not bear to answer, so he made the question permanently unanswerable. He cloned her rather than choose her. He turned love into a coin flip and then threw away the coin. It is the exact mechanism Dr. Wong named in the therapy office, the brilliant mind used to escape the the unbearable work of feeling, taken to its furthest and saddest conclusion. A father who cannot say whether he loves his daughter solves the problem by ensuring there is no single daughter left to love. The reason becomes clear when it is held up against the wound underneath everything. Rick has already lived through the death of one specific, irreplaceable person he loved, and it destroyed him so completely that he spent a lifetime and a multiverse trying to avenge it, only to be left hollow. To love one real, particular daughter is to be exposed all over again to that exact catastrophe, the loss of a single person who cannot be swapped or replaced or portaled around. So Rick did the only thing his fear would allow. He made his daughter into two. He made her interchangeable, made her a question with no answer, so that he would never again have to feel the specific terror of loving one fragile person who could be taken from him. The clone is Diane's death preempted, the loss made impossible by making the daughter unreal. He would rather have two replaceable Beths than one true one he might someday have to mourn. And the show, fittingly, refuses to resolve any of it. It never tells the audience which Beth is real. It never lets Rick find out. The family chooses not to learn, settling instead into a life with two badass mothers and a question deliberately left open. In a multiverse Rick built to be infinite and interchangeable, the question of which copy is the original turns out to have no answer and perhaps no meaning. And the series lets that emptiness stand. Both Beths are real, neither is the first. The mystery is not a puzzle the writers forgot to solve. It is the philosophy made flesh, the logic of replaceable people finally arriving at the dinner table, and a family quietly agreeing not to ask whether any of them are who they think they are. It is one more wall in the end, the same as the catchphrase and the nihilism and the curve around infinity. Each one keeps the unbearable truth at a safe distance. Each one lets Rick avoid the single thing he cannot survive, which is loving one real person enough to lose them. The cloning is just the most intimate version of the cage, built not around the multiverse this time, but around his own child. Which leaves only one question left for the whole series to answer, the question every wall has been holding off since the very first episode. A man who has spent his entire life refusing to feel, refusing to choose, refusing to be known, refusing even to know his own daughter. Can he ever actually stop? The final section returns to the pain hiding behind every joke and asks whether Rick Sanchez is capable of ever putting the armor down. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick answered a question about loving his daughter by cloning her and erasing his own memory of which one is real, turning the deepest feeling into a puzzle with no solution so he would never risk losing one irreplaceable person again. The show refuses to ever resolve it, letting the emptiness stand as the philosophy made flesh. In the final section, all the walls come together, and the series asks whether a man this afraid to feel can ever truly change. Section 10, the pain behind the joke. Return, at the end of all of this, to the very first thing. A man stands in a room full of people, throws his head back, and shouts a string of happy nonsense at the top of his lungs. Wubba lubba dub dub. Everyone laughs. The sound is bright and silly and meaningless, a piece of pure cartoon foolishness, and for a long time that is all anyone heard. But the words were never nonsense. In the language of an old friend, they mean that the speaker is in great pain and is begging for someone to help him. Rick had been saying it all along, at parties, in fights, in every quiet moment he needed to fill with noise, crying out for help in a voice so ridiculous that not one person around him and not one person watching ever stopped to hear it. That single early moment contains the entire show. A person in agony, asking to be saved, in a way designed to make sure no one ever answers. Everything traced across this long story has been a variation on that one gesture. The catchphrase hid a confession inside a joke. The drinking held the feelings at a distance. The death ray in the garage was the pain turned inward. The surrender to the Federation was the pain disguised as sacrifice. The conquest of a galaxy was grief reshaped into a power move. And the pickle was an entire bloody adventure invented to dodge one honest hour in a chair. The nihilism that runs through every season is armor over a wound, a way of insisting that nothing matters so that the death of a wife and child would not have to matter. The wall Rick built around infinity, the central finite curve, is a cage constructed to guarantee he would never have to be ordinary. And the cloning of his own daughter, the refusal to ever know which Beth is real, is the same fear arriving at the dinner table. A man making the people he loves interchangeable so that losing one of them could never break him the way the first loss did. Every one of these is the same move. Keep the unbearable thing on the other side side of a wall. Stay clever enough, busy enough, far enough away that the feeling can never quite reach him. Underneath all of its science fiction and all of its chaos, this is what the series is actually about. It is a study of intelligence used as a means of avoidance. The therapist named it precisely in that strip mall office, when she told Rick that everyone in his family uses their intelligence to justify their sickness, and that he swings between treating his own mind as an unstoppable force and an inescapable curse. His genius is not the thing that saves him, it is the thing that imprisons him. A simpler man, faced with grief he could not carry, might have broken down, reached out, asked for help, done the slow and frightening work of healing. Rick is too smart for that. His mind is so powerful that it can build an escape from any feeling, a justification for any avoidance, a wall around any truth. The smartest being in the entire multiverse turns out to be the most thoroughly trapped, precisely because his intelligence is so good at constructing exits from his own heart. He can solve anything except the one problem that cannot be solved by being clever, which is the problem of simply allowing himself to feel what he feels and be known by someone who cares. The comedy of the show works the same way, and this is the quiet brilliance of how it is built. The jokes, the absurdity, the speed, the catchphrase that everyone repeated for years, all of it functions as a kind of armor, the same armor Rick wears. The form of the show mirrors the psychology of its main character. For seasons, audiences laughed at the surface and never noticed the wound underneath, in exactly the way the characters laughed at Wubba Lubba Dub Dub without ever hearing the cry for help inside it. The show made everyone watching complicit in the avoidance. It buried its sadness so deep beneath the comedy that most people experienced it as a fun, wild, clever adventure show, and only later, slowing down, lining the pieces up, did the grief become visible. The jokes were never separate from the pain. They were the place the pain was hiding, both for Rick and for the show itself. The infinite multiverse, in the end, is the perfect metaphor for all of it. A universe so vast that nothing in it can possibly be special is the exact dream a person would build if he could not afford for anything to be special. If there are infinite Dianes, then losing one is not a catastrophe. If there are infinite Mortys, then no single grandson is irreplaceable. If there are infinite versions of every choice, then no choice carries any real weight. The endless realities are not just a setting for adventures. They are a philosophy of comfort for a man who has lost too much, a way of shrinking every tragedy down to a statistical nothing. And the genius of the show is that it keeps proving this comfort to be a lie. Across all those infinite realities, the characters keep doing the one thing the philosophy says is pointless. They keep choosing each other. Summer chooses to stay rather than run. Morty keeps coming back to a grandfather who endangers him. Rick, who claims nothing matters, spends a lifetime avenging a single death and is hollowed out when the revenge gives him nothing. The nihilism is stated loudly in every episode and contradicted quietly in every episode. And the distance between the two is where all the show's truth lives. People who truly believed nothing mattered would not keep acting again and again as though something did. Which leaves the one question the series circles for its entire run and pointedly refuses to answer. Can Rick change? The therapist laid out the choice plainly. Maintaining a life is just work, unglamorous and safe. And some people are able to do that work, while some people would rather die than face it. And each person gets to choose which they will be. The whole show, in a sense, is the long test of whether Rick will ever choose the work. The evidence runs in both directions, and the writers seem determined to keep it that way. On one side, Rick keeps returning to the family, keeps loving Morty in spite of himself, keeps doing things a true nihilist would never bother to do. On the other side, he keeps building walls, keeps drinking, keeps cloning and conquering and running. And the creator himself has described the later Rick as more isolated than ever, a man consciously invested in his own destruction. The completion of the revenge looked, for a moment, like it might be a turning point, the removal of the last thing he could chase, leaving him with nowhere left to run except inward. But the show does not let that moment resolve into healing. It leaves him standing over a corpse, empty, with the question still open. There is a reason the series refuses to give a clean answer, and it is the bravest thing about the whole show. A neat redemption arc, a season where Rick finally goes to therapy and learns to love and becomes whole, would be a lie about how this kind of pain actually works. Real people carrying real grief do not heal on a television schedule. They get stuck. They build the same walls over and over. They make progress and then retreat from it. They reach the edge of feeling something true and then crack a joke and go get a drink. Rick's failure to change, season after season, is not a writing problem or a missed opportunity. It is the most honest thing the show does. It keeps its central character genuinely, painfully stuck, because that is what avoidance this deep actually looks like, and it trusts the audience to sit with a story that does not tie its sadness up with a bow. So the show ends again and again where it began, with a man in pain asking for help in the only voice he can bear to use, hoping against everything that someone will finally hear what the silly words really mean. After all of it, the crashes and the conquests and the curve around infinity and the daughter he cannot bear to know, the most devastating thing remains that earliest and smallest moment, before any of the lore, before any of the reveals. A lonely genius shouting his pain into a room full of people who only hear a punchline. And the deepest tragedy of Rick Sanchez is not that no one could save him. It is that the one thing his infinite intelligence could never build across all the universes he ever curated for himself was the simple, frightening, ordinary courage to put the joke down, say the words plainly, and let himself be helped. The cry was always real. The translation was always there for anyone willing to listen. The help just never came, because the only person who could let it in was the one person who had spent his whole life making sure the door stayed shut. That is the show, underneath the spaceships and the portals and the endless clever noise. Not a story about the smartest man in the universe, a story about the loneliest one. A man who built infinity into a cage, dressed his grief as wisdom, turned his love into a coin flip, and shouted for help in a language he made certain no one would understand, and who remains, at the close of every season, exactly where the very first episode found him, in great pain. Asking, in his own broken way, for someone to please, finally, help him. And still, after all this time, not quite able to believe that he deserves it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.